February 6, 1942, Barents Sea, Uro 7:30 hours. The horizon was nothing but a gray, merciless line where frozen sea met frozen sky. Lieutenant Ivan Golubets sat cramped in the cockpit of his Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik, hands gripping the control stick with the kind of tension that came not from fear, but from absolute focus. Around him, the roar of the Mikulin AM-38 engine drowned out everything except the crackling voice of his squadron leader over the radio. "Diamond Flight, hold formation. Enemy aircraft spotted at 2 o'clock, high." Ivan's jaw tightened, his breath fogged in the freezing cockpit despite the engine heat bleeding through the metal frame. Outside, the temperature hovered at -35 degrees Celsius. Inside wasn't much better. The Il-2 was built for one thing: survival under fire. Armored like a tank, slow as a freight train, and lethal as a viper. The Germans called it the Schwarzer Tod, the Black Death. But right now, Ivan wasn't hunting, he was protecting. Below him, spread across the churning waters of the Barents Sea, was Convoy PQ-12, a lifeline of Allied supply ships carrying ammunition, medicine, trucks, and tanks to the Soviet Union's northern ports. Without these convoys, the war in the Arctic would collapse. The Germans knew it. That's why they sent everything they had to sink them: U-boats, surface raiders, and above all, the Luftwaffe. Ivan scanned the sky, his breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He was 24 years old, born in a village so small it didn't appear on most maps, nestled in the Ural Mountains where winter lasted 9 months, and survival meant knowing how to hunt, fish, and endure cold that could kill a man in minutes. His father had been a trapper. His mother, a schoolteacher who made sure Ivan could read before he could tie his boots. When war came in 1941, Ivan had been studying engineering in Sverdlovsk. He'd volunteered the day after Hitler's invasion, not out of ideology, but something simpler: duty. His country was bleeding, and he had hands that could hold a gun, or in his case, a control stick. 6 months of brutal training later, he was in the Arctic, flying one of the most dangerous missions of the war. "Contact! Bandits inbound, 12 o'clock. Ivan's eyes snapped forward. There, breaking through the clouds like wolves descending on a herd, were 6 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, their sleek silhouettes cutting through the gray sky with predatory precision. The convoy was their prey. "All units, engage! Protect the convoy!" The radio exploded with voices. Ivan pushed the throttle forward, feeling the Il-2 groan and surge ahead. The Sturmovik wasn't built for dogfighting. It was built to take punishment and dish it out. But out here, over the open sea with no ground targets, it was just him, his gunner Sergeant Petrov in the rear seat, and a machine that was about to be tested to its absolute limits. The first Messerschmitt Dove. Ivan banked hard right, the G-forces slamming him into his seat. Tracer rounds zipped past his canopy, bright streaks of death that looked almost beautiful against the gray void. Petrov opened fire with the rear-mounted 12.7-meter Berezin machine gun, the staccato thunk-thunk-thunk reverberating through the fuselage. "Come on, you bastard," Ivan muttered through clenched teeth. The German pilot was good, too good. He came around for another pass, this time from above. Ivan had seconds to react. He pushed the stick forward, diving toward the sea, using gravity and the Il-2's armored belly to shield himself from the attack. But the Messerschmitt stayed on him. Then it happened. A burst of cannon fire tore through his left wing. Metal shrieked, the engine sputtered, warning lights blazed across his instrument panel like a Christmas tree from hell. Smoke began pouring from the cowling, thick and black, choking the cockpit with the acrid stench of burning oil. "Petrov, we're hit!" No response. Ivan twisted in his seat, looking back. The rear canopy was shattered. Petrov slumped forward, blood streaking his flight jacket. Dead. Panic tried to claw its way into Ivan's mind, but he crushed it down with iron discipline. The Il-2 was dying. Fire licked along the left engine mount. The altimeter was spinning downward, 2,000 meters, 1,500, 1,000. The aircraft was losing altitude fast, and the freezing Barents Sea waited below like an open grave. Ivan had 2 choices: ride the plane down and die in the crash, or eject and take his chances in water cold enough to kill him in under 15 minutes. The convoy was still 2 kilometers away. If his burning aircraft crashed into the ships, it could cause catastrophic damage, maybe even sink one of the freighters loaded with ammunition. The decision took less than a second. Ivan yanked the control stick hard left, steering the flaming Sturmovik away from the convoy and out toward open water. His hands moved on instinct, reaching for the ejection lever. The cockpit was filling with smoke. His lungs burned. The heat from the fire was unbearable. "Forgive me, Petrov," he whispered. Then he pulled the lever. The explosive bolts blew the canopy clear. Wind hit Ivan like a freight train, ripping the breath from his lungs. He was thrown upward, tumbling through freezing air, disoriented, half blind from smoke. His training kicked in. Count to 3, pull the ripcord. But time felt warped, stretched thin by adrenaline and terror. 1, 2, 3. He yanked the ripcord. The parachute deployed with a violent jerk that nearly dislocated his shoulders. Suddenly, the world slowed. The roar of the engine faded. Below him, his Il-2 spiraled into the sea and exploded on impact, sending up a plume of steam and fire. Above him, the dogfight continued. The Messerschmitts were pulling away. Mission accomplished. They'd driven off one attacker. But Ivan wasn't thinking about that anymore. He was thinking about the water rushing up to meet him. The Barents Sea, -2 degrees Celsius. Survival time, 10 to 15 minutes before hypothermia rendered you unconscious. He hit the water hard. The cold was a physical blow, so intense it stopped his heart for half a second. His body convulsed. Every nerve screamed. The parachute dragged him under, the silk canopy filling with water and pulling him down into the black depths like a living thing trying to drown him. Ivan clawed at the release buckle, his fingers already numb, barely responding. Panic surged, real, primal panic, as water filled his mouth, his nose. His lungs burned for air. Move or die. He yanked the buckle free, the parachute released. Ivan kicked upward, breaching the surface with a gasp that felt like swallowing knives. Waves crashed over him, each one a hammer blow. The wind cut through his soaked flight suit like it wasn't even there. He was alone. The convoy was already disappearing into the distance, unaware he'd even gone down. The sky was empty, the dogfight over. Around him, there was nothing but endless gray water, endless gray sky, and cold so absolute it felt like the universe itself wanted him dead. Ivan Golubets floated in the frozen Barents Sea, clinging to a scrap of parachute fabric, and made a promise to himself. "I will not die here. Not today. Not ever." The first shock struck Ivan Golubets the moment his body touched the icy surface of the Barents Sea. The water was a merciless blade, sharper than any bullet he had dodged, his muscles locked, nerves on fire from the brutal cold. Panic threatened to consume him like the water itself. But the lessons of survival, the years in the steppes and mountains of the Urals, were etched deep into his bones. Do not thrash, conserve energy, control your breathing. His fingers, barely able to move, struggled to grasp the torn fabric of his parachute drifting beside him. The waves tossed him like a rag doll. He fought to keep his head above water, every breath a searing pain. Hours passed, or was it minutes? Time lost all meaning in the endless gray tundra of sea and sky. Ivan's mind wandered to his mother's face, worn yet warm, the smile of Katerina, his fiancée, who had promised him a home to come back to. He clung to their images like a lifeline. The freezing chill began its assault. His toes numbed first, then his legs. The sensation was gone, replaced by an unbearable heaviness. Cold slipped into his bones, creeping upward, stealing warmth, life, hope, hypothermia. It was a word he had only heard whispered in the medical tents behind the front lines, a slow, merciless thief of the living. Still, Ivan forced himself to move. Tiny, controlled movements, rubbing elbows and knees, squeezing thick gloves together. The parachute silk was wet and heavy, but it was better than nothing. It provided some shield against the swirling, freezing waves. Night fell like a shroud. The wind howled above him, and the dark swallowed the horizon. In the distance, lights flickered, faint glimmers from the escort ships that had long since passed. He screamed into the void, a wild, raw sound that burnt his throat. But no answer came. Ivan's thoughts fragmented. The cold gnawed at his consciousness, dragging him toward darkness. Faces from his past flickered in nightmares. his childhood friend lost in a hunting accident, comrades fallen in battle, the grave silence of the battlefield. But his training refused to let go. Every second awake was a battle won against the inevitable. In the silent cold of that cruel sea, Ivan found himself fighting not just for life, but for meaning. Each breath was a testament to defiance against nature and against war. Then, just before dawn, a predatory shadow broke the stillness. A German U-boat's periscope sliced through the water not 20 meters from where Ivan floated. Heart pounding, frozen limbs barely responding, Ivan knew salvation or death was minutes away. Would the enemy see the lone survivor in the sea? Would he be rescued or captured? Or would the cold water was beginning to claim Ivan Golubets? His limbs were numb and unresponsive. The relentless Barents Sea showed no mercy. Yet, his mind remained razor-sharp, fueled by survival instinct honed through years of hardship and war. Hours earlier, as the German U-boat's periscope flicked above the waves, Ivan knew his fate teetered on a razor's edge. The U-boat slipped silently beneath the icy surface, a dark hunter of the northern seas, leaving behind only ripples and a chilling silence. Whether it spared him intentionally or never saw him at all, Ivan was alone once again. The relentless cold had slowed his heartbeat to a crawl. His eyes, glassy and wet from salt and cold, scanned the empty horizon for any sign of rescue. The convoy was gone, out of sight and mind. The distant echo of cannon fire from a naval skirmish reminded him of a brutal reality. War did not pause for suffering. Ivan's tactical mind kicked in. Every piece of training, every battle tactic replayed in his thoughts. His hands, though frostbitten and sluggish, found the makeshift flotation device, his parachute's wreckage, and held on with a death grip. But the cold was more than a physical enemy. It was a psychological tormentor, plunging him into a cruel limbo where time warped, memories bled into hallucinations, and the boundary between life and death blurred. In this twilight, Ivan saw visions of his childhood home in the Urals, the smell of pine and frozen earth, the crackle of the fire in his family's small cabin. He remembered his mother's face, so reassuring, and heard her voice calling him to come home. He saw the last letter from Katerina, tinged with hope and worry. Yet all these ghosts also spurred him back from the brink. Pain stabbed through his frozen muscles when he shifted, a reminder that he was still alive, still fighting. The hours passed indistinctly. Above, the Arctic twilight barely pierced the clouds. Instead, a dull gray persisted, the eternal dusk of polar winter. Suddenly, faint noises reached his ears, muffled, unnatural against the steady hum of waves. A distress flare skittered across the sky, brilliant red against the dull gray. A signal. Ivan's heart hammered. Was it friend or foe? His throat raw from cold and silence, he tried to call out, but his voice was nothing but a faint croak swallowed by the sea winds. A worn American Liberty ship, part of the convoy's escort, emerged through the fog like a ghost. Its searchlights swept the water. Mechanical voices crackled orders over radios. Sailors manned lookouts, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Ivan summoned every ounce of remaining strength, waving what little he could in the air. A mirage of red flare twirled slowly, signaling his frantic hope. The men on deck spotted him. Shouts rang out. Life-saving rings were thrown, ropes lowered. As hands grabbed him from the frost-bitten sea, Ivan felt the world tilt, then steady. Pulled aboard the ship, his body was weak, blue with freezing cold. Medical officers worked rapidly. Wet clothing was stripped, blankets wrapped around icicle limbs, hot water bottles pressed against his chest. Through the haze of hypothermia, Ivan's gaze met the eyes of a young medic. She spoke urgently, but kind. A lifeline in the darkest night. Ivan whispered, barely audible, "I survived. For them. For the fight." His ordeal was far from over. The war raged on. But for now, defying death had carved his name into the annals of survival against impossible odds. The transport ship cut through the icy Barents Sea like a steel arrow, carrying Ivan Golubets away from death's icy grip. But survival outside the water was only the beginning. The hospital was not a place of peace. It was a frontline battle against the damage war had dealt to Ivan's body and spirit. The makeshift Arctic field hospital was a frozen fortress of noise, light, and urgency. Inside, the remote warmth of stoves battled the perpetual cold, while doctors and nurses worked under exhaustion and relentless pressure. Every wound told a story of sacrifice, pain, and the fight to keep soldiers alive for yet another day. Ivan was moved swiftly and silently. The weight of loss hung heavy in the air, the groans of the wounded, the cries of medics, the shouts of orders mixing with the faint drone of anti-aircraft guns outside. The chief surgeon, Colonel Mikhail Petrov, a man whose reputation was built on saving lives others left for dead, stood over Ivan's frozen, bruised form. The bullet wound that ripped through Ivan's side had narrowly missed his heart and lung, yet had shredded muscles and ribs, leaving ragged shards of bone threatening every breath. "We don't have luxuries here," Petrov barked to his team. "Stabilize him, keep that body warm. Hypothermia is the killer here, then surgery." Ivan's consciousness drifted in a haze of painkillers, nightmares, and surging memories. The cold sea's grip lingered, claw marks on his skin and mind. In the night, soldiers came and went, many bearing stories darker than Ivan could imagine. A young infantryman lost half his face to a grenade blast. An artillery sergeant watched helplessly as his crew was wiped out by a surprise shelling. The front line extended from trenches and skies into the sterile chaos of this hospital room. Sleep was scarce and never peaceful. Ivan dreamt of return missions, of engine roars and tracer fire. Most nights, the line between nightmare and memory blurred, war invading his resting mind. One night, the distant wail of ships firing their anti-aircraft guns awakened Ivan. The Battle of the Barents Sea was raging. German destroyers and cruisers attempted to ambush the convoy under cover of darkness. The hospital's sense of safety was shattered by the rumble of distant explosions and the staccato crack of machine guns. Staff members rushed from tents to check on wounded sailors. Medics raced to tend new casualties from the naval fight, and Ivan felt the raw pulse of war outside his fragile sanctuary. Weeks passed in a blur of treatment and pain. Surgeons rigged splints, nurses changed dressings, and Ivan's body slowly fought infection, fever, and exhaustion. His comrades wrote letters, told tales of battles won and lost, and honored those who never made it back. Yet through blood, ice, and fire, Ivan's resolve hardened. Every day spent in this battle of survival sharpened his determination. He was a soldier, not just a survivor, but a fighter, to the last breath. As the war around him raged on, Ivan understood one truth: victory required more than courage in the air or strength in the sea. It demanded endurance on the hospital front lines, a sacrifice few witnessed, but none escaped. And Ivan Golubets was still fighting. After weeks confined to the cold, crowded ward of the Arctic Field Hospital, Ivan Golubets faced the next grueling battle, reclaiming his shattered body and spirit. The war outside continued its ruthless advance, but Ivan's fight was a slow march through pain, determination, and hope. Each morning, gritty-eyed medics helped him sit up, his body screaming protest against the simple act of movement. The bullet had torn through ribs and muscle. Frostbite had claimed the tips of his fingers and toes. Exposure had weakened his lungs, yet Ivan refused to yield to despair. Nursing station reports patient showing steady signs of recovery, a young nurse said softly, putting a hand on his shoulder as she handed him warm tea. The small kindness was like light in the Arctic darkness. But recovery was never just physical. Memories of the freezing sea haunted his dreams. The faces of fallen comrades chased his waking hours, as did the weight of guilt, survivor's guilt, that burdened him like armor. One afternoon, a shadow fell over his bed. Commanding Officer Colonel Sokolov entered, flanked by other officers. Sokolov's stern eyes held unexpected warmth. "You've done the impossible, Lieutenant," he said gravely. "The war needs men like you. When you're ready, we'll put you back in the sky." Ivan's heart pounded. The thought of returning to the cockpit, facing enemy fire again, was both terrifying and electrifying. Physical therapy sessions tested every ounce of his will, moving his stiff limbs, relearning to walk without collapsing, grappling with numbness that sometimes felt permanent. Yet Ivan pushed onward, driven by fierce patriotism and memories of the convoy, those lives depending on pilots like him. Meanwhile, the hospital buzzed with war news. Reports filtered in about harsh battles from Murmansk and the Kola Peninsula, fierce fights where every yard of territory was soaked in blood and bile. The Arctic front was an unforgiving crucible, but the will of the Soviet soldier was ironclad. Ivan spent hours listening to veteran stories, each tale of courage stirring something deep inside him. These men and women were his family now, wounded but unbroken. Then came the day Ivan returned to flight school. The heavy cold weather gear, the roar of engines, the smell of oil and gunpowder, all flooded back. The sky was a battlefield, but also freedom. "Get ready, Lieutenant," his instructor barked during training runs. "You're going back to the front." Training was harsh. War had evolved. Pilots had to be sharper, faster, new tactics, new weapons. Ivan faced the challenge not just to survive, but to triumph. As he strapped into the cockpit, watching the ice-covered tundra blur below, Ivan felt a fierce certainty. No matter the wounds, no matter the nightmares, he would fight for his country, for his fallen comrades. For the home waiting in the distance, because true war was never over until the last soldier came home. Ivan Golubets sat rigid in the cockpit of a freshly overhauled Il-2, his fingers barely trembling as they wrapped around the cold metal controls. The Arctic air bit through the canopy, relentless even inside the armored plane. The sky stretched vast and unforgiving, the same ruthless expanse he had once fallen through, now his domain once more. The journey back had been long and grueling. Months of rehabilitation, layered with hours of training to sharpen skills dulled by injury and absence. But Ivan's resolve never wavered. His thoughts were a storm of determination, memory, and purpose. Every scar was a reminder, every ache a call to duty. "Ready for the sortie, Lieutenant?" barked his flight commander, Captain Voronov, a grizzled veteran whose icy gaze had seen too many comrades fall. "The convoy is due to pass near Kola Bay. Intelligence warns of increased Luftwaffe presence." Ivan nodded without a word. The cold had killed many, but not the spirit of those who flew to protect their country's lifeline. The convoy shimmered through thin Arctic fog below, a serpentine chain of freighters and escort warships slicing through the freezing waves. The enemy's shadow was never far. Radar reports indicated swift-moving German fighters lurking beyond the cloud cover, eager to strike. With a sudden roar, the flight surged forward, engines echoing across ice-crusted fjords. The sky turned into a battlefield of speed, machine, and death. Enemy fighters appeared like ghosts from Ivan's darkest memories, agile, ruthless. His hands flew over controls, aiming his twin 23mm cannon with precision, born from months in simulators and torrents of real battle. Tracer rounds stitched deadly webs around his plane. A burst hit, rumbling through the fuselage, but Ivan pressed on, returning fire with ferocity. His wingman, junior pilot Lieutenant Makarov, dove beside him, their coordination seamless, a silent language forged by trust and countless sorties. On the deck below, ships swayed beneath hailstorms of flak and bursting shells. Explosions rocked the convoy. A freighter caught fire, sending a towering plume of black smoke into the air. Ivan's mind raced. Protect that ship at all costs. As he maneuvered through swirling smoke and shattered clouds, the war raged both around him and within. Each enemy plane downed was a breath stolen from the enemy, each miss a risk to those below. Suddenly, a violent explosion rocked his aircraft's tail. The controls clenched tight in his hands, twitched uncontrollably. Warning lights blinked with urgent flashes. "We're hit!" Ivan shouted over the radio to Makarov. "Brace yourself!" The IL-2 shuddered violently, spiraling toward the sea. Years of battle-honed instincts sparked rapid decisions. Ivan banked hard, stabilizing the plane barely, steering it away from ships and rocks below. "They won't take me again," he vowed, recalling that fatal day months ago. His voice steadied despite the chaos. Prepare to bail out. But fate was harsher than iron. Before deploying the chute, a second blast tore through the engine. Flames licked the fuselage, thick smoke blinding the cockpit. Ivan wrestled with the controls as the IL-2 hurtled downward. Seconds stretched, every heartbeat thunderous. Then the cold sea awaited, silent, endless, merciless. The icy grip of the Barents Sea welcomed Ivan Golubets like a relentless specter, haunting his every breath. Less than a year after his first fall into its freezing embrace, fate had dealt him the cruelest hand yet. A second crash, a second plunge into waters that sought to swallow him once and for all. The shattered Il-2 fuselage had barely touched the sea before Ivan was thrown clear, lungs burning, body thrashing against the cold water that pierced every layer of clothing and armor. His flight suit, heavy with fuel and soaked through, dragged him down in the beginning, but Ivan's training and sheer willpower snapped into action. He fought the instinct to panic, a killer in these waters, and instead focused on small, controlled movements. His fingers, stiff and slow, found the tangled remnants of his parachute lines. With effort that felt almost superhuman, he untangled himself and kicked upward, breaking the surface with a raw gasp of air that seared his frozen throat. Around him, the sea was a lonely giant, indifferent. Gray skies blended seamlessly with a gray, storm-churned horizon. The desperate calls and shouts of the battle above were now distant echoes, replaced by the sinister quiet of Arctic winter. Every second in this icy abyss was a struggle for life. The numbness was spreading fast, fingers and toes turning blue, then white, then impossible to feel. Ivan's muscles threatened to seize with cold cramps. Yet something far deeper than flesh and blood kept him afloat, the unrelenting fire of survival. His mind grasped at memories to anchor him, the warmth of his mother's hands, the laughter of comrades in a bleak barracks, the steady voice of Captain Voronov and his last words before the sortie. We fight as one. We survive as one. Even in the cruel cold, in this silent, frozen expanse, Ivan felt the pulse of his past comrades fighting alongside him in spirit. Hours stretched into eternity. His body trembled uncontrollably as hypothermia's shadow stole his strength bit by bit. Yet Ivan's will hardened like steel forged under fire. He kicked, swam, clung to the shredded silk of his parachute, a fragile lifeline against the abyss. Then, through the thick haze of cold and exhaustion, a distant glow appeared, a faint red flare on the horizon, cutting through the gray veil like a beacon. Hope. His lungs screamed for air, but Ivan fought each breath, willing himself to hold on, to reach it. Closer came the thunderous beat of naval engines, the unmistakable silhouette of a Soviet naval trawler breaking through the waves. Crew members shouted orders, eyes sharp for any sign of survivors. Ivan's strength faltered, his limbs betrayed him just as he was pulled from the water's clutch into strong, steady arms. Shouts of relief and urgency filled the air, replaced by the soft warmth of blankets, hot tea, and the gentle touch of medics fighting to bring him back from the edge. On board, Ivan lay shivering but alive, caught between two worlds, one icy and indifferent, one filled with the fierce determination of those who refused to let him perish. As the trawler sped toward safety, with the convoy still braving the Arctic's wrath ahead, Ivan closed his eyes. For in this cold war against death, he had won, but the battle was far from over. The Ilyushin Il-2 was more than just a plane. It was a symbol of Soviet resilience and brutal efficiency on the battlefield. Known as the flying tank, it carried armor plating that protected both pilot and vital components, and pack firepower that could smash tanks, trains, and enemy fortifications alike. Ivan Golubets gripped the stick of his Il-2 as the formation roared into the enemy's rear lines, a swarm of steel spears tipped with bombs, rockets, and 23mm cannons. The roar of the Mikulin AM-38 engine filled his ears, drowning out the screams of distant artillery and the chatter of radio commands. The mission was clear: attack the German armored columns moving on the Karelian Isthmus, crushing tanks, trucks, and supply lines to cripple their advance and save Soviet infantry from annihilation. Their flight took them low over shattered snowfields, where trails of burned-out vehicles scarred the frozen earth. German anti-aircraft fire exploded around them like thunderstorms. The sky turned into a maelstrom of tracer fire, bursting shells and roaring engines. Ivan sighted a column of Panzer III and IV tanks crawling down a forest road. Below the thunder of engines, the earth shook with tank treads and artillery. "Hold steady," Ivan muttered, lining up his attack. The Il-2's primary weapons, Two 23mm VYA-23 cannons mounted in the wings spoke with terrifying power. The pilot's view was enhanced by the optical sight VV-1, allowing precise strikes from low altitude. Ivan unleashed a barrage of fire and rockets, the RS-82 and RS-132 unguided missiles that screamed down like thunderbolts, aiming for the softer spots on the tanks and vehicles. Explosions rocked the ground as his rockets detonated with brutal efficiency. Suddenly, a hailstorm of German 80mm flak lit up the sky. One fiery burst hit Ivan's wing. The plane shuddered violently, but the armor held like the legend it was. "We're taking fire! Return fire, Petrov!" Ivan yelled over the roar. Sergeant Petrov manned the rear turret, a 12.7mm UBT heavy machine gun, spraying tracer rounds at attacking Messerschmitts trying to flank them. The two-man team was a lethal duo. While Ivan focused on ground targets, Petrov guarded their six against fighter attacks. The battle raged close and fierce, the line between hunter and hunted blurred in the swirling smoke and tearing cold wind. Ivan's machine guns shredded enemy vehicles, his bombs blasted supply caches, turning the battlefield into a deadly furnace. Every successful strike was a victory for the soldiers waiting at the front lines, counting on air power to break the enemy's momentum. As the rocky coastline of the Kola Peninsula disappeared behind them, a new threat emerged. German Focke-Wulf fighters dived in coordinated strikes. The Il-2 was tough but slow, vulnerable in dogfights. Ivan dove and rolled, trying to shake his attackers. Petrov sprayed bursts sideways, keeping a deadly hail of bullets on their tails. Explosions rocked the wing edges as near misses shook the plane like a rag doll. This was the essence of the Il-2's brutal role. Close air support, pounding enemy positions with monstrous firepower, surviving impossible odds, and always fighting forward. The sortie ended with the squadron returning battered but victorious. Their combined effort had destroyed dozens of enemy vehicles, stalled the German advance, and saved countless Soviet lives. Ivan exhaled, fatigue pulling at his body, but a fierce pride burned in his chest. This was war. Harsh, merciless, and fought with steel and fire, and he was ready to face it head-on again. The Ilyushin Il-2 wasn't just a plane. It was a flying fortress, a steel bulwark against the relentless German advance. Armor plating ranging from 6 to 12 millimeters wrapped its cockpit and vital parts, shielding the pilot like a medieval knight in an unyielding suit of armor. This beast measured 11.6 meters in length, with a wingspan stretching 14.6 meters and weighed over 4.5 tons when empty. Powered by the formidable Mikulin AM-38F engine, delivering 1750 horsepower, the Il-2 was designed to punch hard and survive harder. It could reach speeds up to 403 kilometers per hour near the ground, diving over tanks and artillery positions at breakneck velocity. Its agility was sharp despite the heavy armor, capable of rapid turns and steep dives, essential for attacking enemy ground forces under fire. Its weaponry inspired fear and respect. Twin 23mm VYA-23 cannons roared bursts of death, complemented by two synchronized 7.62mm HKAS machine guns delivering precise fire. On its wings, it carried destructive RS-82 and RS-132 rockets, as well as bombs that could obliterate armored columns or entrenched positions. Despite its strength, early Il-2s had vulnerabilities. The rear gunner's position, added in later models, was often exposed, leaving the gunner dangerously unprotected. Fuel tanks were prone to catching fire before field modifications improved armor shielding. Piloting an Il-2 demanded courage and skill, flying low beneath enemy anti-aircraft fire, navigating the deadly geometry of flak, fighters, and exploding ground targets required nerves of steel. Ivan Golubets knew this intimately. Every sortie pushed him into the eye of the storm, where survival often came down to split-second decisions and iron willpower. His knowledge of his plane's strengths and weaknesses, combined with years of combat experience, allowed him to leverage the Il-2's formidable arsenal to decimate enemy forces while enduring near-impossible odds. In battle, the Il-2 was a terror patrol, carrying the fury of Soviet resistance firepower into the heart of the enemy's advance. It was not just an aircraft, it was a symbol of survival against overwhelming odds, much like Ivan himself. The fields of frozen earth and shattered roads that once echoed with the roar of engines and the thunder of artillery have long since fallen silent. Yet, the echoes of Ivan Golubets' story and that of the Ilyushin Il-2 resonate through history as a testament to resilience, sacrifice, and the indomitable spirit of those who fought. Ivan survived 2 plunges into the deadly icy waters of the Barents Sea, defying death itself not once, but twice. He triumphed over wounds that would have ended most men and returned to the sky time and again, each sortie a furious battle between steel will and mortal danger. The Il-2, flying tank, which carried Ivan into countless battles, was more than a machine. It was a symbol of Soviet strength and ingenuity. Over 36,000 Il-2s were built during World War II, the most produced combat aircraft in aviation history. They shaped the course of the war across every front, from the frozen tundra of the Arctic to the burning plains of Eastern Europe. With armor up to 12 millimeters thick and armed with powerful 23 millimeter cannons, rockets, and bombs, the Il-2 was vital in blasting enemy tanks, destroying supply lines, and weakening German defenses. It sustained staggering losses. Over 10,700 airframes were lost in combat, and thousands of brave pilots like Ivan never returned. Yet it remained the backbone of Soviet ground attack aviation. Ivan Golubets' survival and combat record reflect not only personal heroism, but the collective valor of thousands of pilots who faced infernos of anti-aircraft fire, swarms of enemy fighters, and the harshest conditions imaginable. His return to the front after near-death experiences exemplified the grit and sacrifice demanded by total war. In the final months of the war, as Soviet forces pushed westward to Berlin, legions of Il-2s tore through German fortifications, providing crucial support that hastened the collapse of Nazi resistance. Ivan's story closed not in glory on a battlefield, but in quiet dignity. He lived to witness the victory his aircraft and comrades helped secure. His scars, visible and hidden, were badges of endurance. Today, museums preserve the skeletal remains of Il-2s, and monuments stand in frozen villages and great cities alike to honor those who flew the flying tank into the fires of history. Ivan Golubets' name survived in letters, in veteran stories, in the whispered memories of families who waited and prayed. His life, like the Il-2 itself, is a legacy of resilience against overwhelming odds, of fighting through fire and ice for something greater than oneself. In the end, the true victory was the courage to survive and the will to carry on fighting, for freedom, for country, for those awaiting the return of their sons and brothers.